remember when I was a soldier. I remember when I was in Burma.
Amidst the horrors of a world war, we barely remember their story. The thousands of Africans taken to the jungles of Burma by Britain to fight the Japanese.
The order to move came to the West Africans, who were assigned the important job of clearing the Caledon Valley.
We young men, we are not worried. If death comes, it comes. If it doesn't come, it doesn't come.
This man was there.
It's a surprise that I survived it. It's a miracle.
His amazing story took me to Lagos, Nigeria, and from there across 3 continents and 8 decades. And in the jungles of Burma, I found heroism and courage I could never have imagined, and a debt of gratitude still strong after all these years. The Imperial War Museum in London. I came here 2 years ago. I've spent much of my life in Africa, and I've always been fascinated by the little-known story of the African soldiers who fought in Burma in the Second World War, the so-called Burma Boys.
The museum's library is a treasure trove, and I found lots of memoirs about the Burma campaign, but all of them were written by British officers, so they only offer clues as to how the African soldiers felt. Then I found this memoir. It's by Isaac Fadeyebo. I recognize that name as Yoruba. They're the people who live in southwest Nigeria. And it's called A Stroke of Unbelievable Luck. As I started to read it, I felt that the luck was mine.
The heavy fire continued intermittently for more than 1 hour. A colleague of mine, I then knew for sure that I had been hit by bullets. I had a fractured femur very close to the knee, and 1 bullet also pierced my stomach just below the ribs. The situation was indescribable.
It's extremely rare, a detailed, first-hand account of what it was like to be an African soldier fighting for king and empire in that now distant war.
I thought I was going to die in the next few moments. His name was Shuyiman. If their activities regarding our security had been detected by the Japanese troops, the chances were that they would be executed, perhaps along with us. Up till now, there is hardly any day I do not remember Shuyiman and his family.
It's a story of courage and fear and tragedy. But Isaac Fadeyebo survived and wrote this account. I read it transfixed. I didn't know then that Isaac's story would take me on a journey I could scarcely imagine. But I did know straight away that I had to find out if he was still alive. So I travel back to Lagos, Nigeria, a city where I once lived, a place close to my heart. It has a daunting reputation, but I'll always look back on the 3 years I spent here with affection. I was a young reporter, I made wonderful friends. And although Lagos is difficult and frustrating, I was always treated with respect and courtesy by Nigerians. I will never forget that. You won't find many Nigerians today who even remember British rule. It ended more than 50 years ago, and this is a young country with modern challenges. Sometimes the problems seem overwhelming, but keeping a sense of humor always helps in Nigeria. Look deeper in Lagos, and you'll see hints of that British legacy. In old buildings, in old street names. The grainy pictures of a young Queen Elizabeth visiting Lagos in 1956 suggest how much has changed. It was a time when British royalty still commanded unquestioning allegiance, not just at home, but in dozens of countries around the world. The grandeur, the illusion of greatness was still there, but in reality, Britain's power was fast receding.
The infrastructure which my country, Britain, left behind in Nigeria often seems to be crumbling away these days. But overall, the British left a mixed legacy, and there are parts of it which leave me feeling very uncomfortable.
Strong, tough, most magnificently built race in the world, Negro soldiers march barefoot to their encampment. Africa fights for their cause and ours.
It's one of the forgotten stories of the Second World War. How Britain, in its hour of need, took almost 100,000 African soldiers to fight in the distant jungles of Burma against the all-conquering Japanese. In 1942, the Japanese swept through Asia. The British retreated in chaos, and the jewel of the empire, India, was under threat. In desperation, the British turned to Africa for reinforcements, which could help push the Japanese back.
And in spite of fierce resistance, the 81st drove the enemy from Frontier Hill.
It was one of the war's most brutal campaigns, and yet today the contribution of these African men is all but forgotten. Not just in Britain, but even in their own countries, like Ghana, Kenya, and above all, Nigeria. If I could find Isaac, I could learn so much about the Burma boys. No one who worked on his memoir knew if he was still alive. I made many inquiries, many phone calls, and eventually discovered that Isaac is alive and in Lagos. I'd worked out that he's in his mid-80s. He was only 16 when he signed up to fight.
He remembers those days of empire and colony, but his story is very dramatic and unusual, and it's incredible in every way that he's still with us here today to tell that story. Mr. Fadayebo, it's very nice to meet you. How are you, sir?
I'm talking for a long, long time.
Yeah, and you look well.
Oh,
You're
family?
strong. My family is very well, thank you. It's wonderful to see you, sir.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And how are you feeling?
Fine.
Good.
He wanted to show me proof of his war experience, 2 ancient scraps of paper that barely hint at his adventures.
Okay. And then here, it says campaigns,
Campaign, Burma.
And then...
Burma campaign number 4. It was in 1944 that I fought in Burma. That campaign number 4, they say, you know.
It says medals, not yet decided.
Yes.
So you never got a medal?
No, I didn't get it. Why worry about medals, you know?
Do you wish you got a medal?
Well, if I get it, okay. I don't get it, okay. It doesn't bother me at all. There is proof that I fought, you know, in Burma, you know. That's sufficient for me, you know.
Freedom for you, freedom for everyone, freedom for me, freedom for mommy, freedom.
After the war, Nigeria became independent and Isaac became a civil servant. He raised a family, traveled to Britain, to America. He was a successful man. I arrived just in time for Nigeria's presidential election, and Isaac went to vote at the local polling station. Since independence, Nigeria has suffered military coups, a civil war, terrible ethnic and religious violence. Isaac still has faith in a better future for his country. But what made him fight for the British all those years ago?
I saw the army, well, as a good job, you know. At the age of 16, something like I didn't know what I was doing, you know. They call it youthful exuberance. That's why I joined the army.
Did you feel any loyalty to the British cause in the Second World War?
Not at all. We were colonial people. There's no question of loyalty or patriotism. No. I saw people join in and I followed suit, not knowing that I was heading for trouble.
Britain needed African soldiers, but as the colonial power stayed firmly in charge, it was almost impossible for an African to become a senior officer, and very few, white or black, questioned that.
The British officers, were they good people? Were they kind to you, or were they?
Oh well, generally to every rule there must be an exception. Quite a number of them were good, very good indeed. But some look on us as black monkeys, people from the jungle. People thought black man has tail, but you guys who have been able to come out here and see us, that you know we have no tail.
Isaac left Nigeria on a troop ship in late 1943. They sailed round the Cape because the Mediterranean was not safe, and all the way across the Indian Ocean, docking at Bombay.
The journey took us 6 weeks plus, you know, from Lagos to Bombay. And our first experience that there is something like they call seasick. You won't be able to take food, you will be sneezing, you will be not feeling well. But after a few weeks, you get used to it, you know. That was the only excitement. It's very cool, very sea breeze is there. At times in some areas, the sea can be very rough, very turbulent, and at times very smooth.
They travelled across India to the Burma border. At first it was all very exciting, forming friendships, building camps. A great adventure in an exotic new land. But everyone knew this could not last. The jungle was a tough environment, as Isaac discovered.
Very thick jungle. We don't have it here in Black Africa. Very steepy hill. You have to walk with a stick in our hands, carrying, you know, in full marching order, and with a kit bag on our heads. If you make the mistake, if you slip, you are going to the foot of the hill.
Having met Isaac, I went back to Britain. I wanted to talk to Professor David Killingray, an expert on the Burma boys who edited Isaac's memoir. He could explain why Britain turned to Africa for help in the war.
They were trained, particularly West African troops, in carrying stores and supplies, ammunition, by head in forested areas. And therefore you had this carrier potential which would be very useful to deploy in the steep valley slopes that were wooded in Burma. And so they performed rather well, and particularly in forested terrain. And probably without them, and their head-carrying capacity as porters, the war there would have been prosecuted much more slowly.
Then I tracked down the handful of surviving officers who led African troops. Why did their men want to fight for Britain?
It was the spirit of adventure which prompted so many of them. A young man who joined up could be assured not only of the adventure that he sought, but also plenty of food, rations, meat.
They loved it. They loved being a soldier. Some of them walked miles. When I say miles, I mean probably 100 miles to come and join the army. And I think that it was because they would be somebody. They get their food and they get their clothing.
to get away from the cloying closeness of the village, to see the world, to get away from an unfortunate marriage or an engagement to a woman that you don't really want to marry, or to try and earn money. You'd heard about money. Money enabled you to buy things. It gave you greater independence.
They regarded their army service, I think, as a job more than... I don't think there was any great feeling of patriotism there. I didn't gather that. They were very different from us. They hadn't the benefit of education that we had, but they were human beings, and most of them with a great sense of humour as well.
Here in London, it's taken the British a long time to acknowledge their war debt to Africa and to the rest of the empire. But in this story, there is one great irony. Because by recruiting all those African men to defend their empire, the British in the end may have undermined it. At the end of the war, most of those African soldiers came home, and they brought with them new ideas, new perspectives. They travelled the world after all. And those who were in the jungles of Burma saw that white and black are not so different after all, that we're all capable of courage, cowardice, intelligence, stupidity. We're all human. And as more and more Africans came to understand that, Britain's imperial authority was fatally undermined.
India, on the eve of independence, turned to the Mahatma for guidance.
In India, Gandhi was already leading a freedom struggle. Officers in the British Army worried he might influence Africans. Isaac actually saw Gandhi on his journey across India. Although he wasn't thinking about independence for Nigeria, other African soldiers say they did pick up subversive ideas about freedom.
Well, I think these feelings are contagious. One must remember that in India there had been the movement for independence long before the outbreak of the war. In every country, the word gets round, doesn't it? And movements, small or large, form and capture the mood and say, why should we remain as under a colonial ruler?
In early 1944, there were more immediate concerns. African troops went into combat, and the Japanese fought ferociously, suffering heavy casualties.
The Japs had met their masters in jungle warfare. They left ample proof of this.
For the Africans, a baptism of fire in the green hell of the jungle. Jack Osborne led Nigerian troops in Burma. He is 102 years old and still haunted by what he saw.
I had soldiers to bury horridly, without any service, without any record of where I'd put them. And I think we don't give sufficient thought to those men who died on the route, in jungle, in conditions where we simply had to leave them if we couldn't carry out a very horrid burial. And they have no memorial.
Do we pay enough credit to them?
No. No, I don't think they were acknowledged properly to what they did, yes. They lost quite a lot of men, and on the whole they fought well. I said before, the most cheerful of soldiers of the lot, I think.
The huge majority of us felt privileged to command these men and to earn their respect and to have them following us into action, or indeed, if they were scouts, leading us into action.
A war between two great empires, Britain and Japan, struggling for control of Asia, leaving hundreds of thousands of dead. And memorials in London, in Lagos, in Japan, whose army suffered the worst of all. More than half of the Japanese soldiers who went to Burma never came back.
I mean, we've got to understand the times in which we lived. It would not happen again, clearly. I believe what that period was, it could be described as a last flourish of empire, never to be repeated.
It was time to pick up Isaac's story again, but first he invited me to a party, Sunday lunch with the family. His daughters and grandchildren are doctors, teachers, designers, photographers, full of the creativity and energy that I always loved in Nigeria. Although Isaac must wonder if they can understand what he went through in the war. Because in February 1944, his story was about to take a fateful turn. Isaac and his colleagues were getting closer to the Japanese. He was in a medical unit, not prepared for the horror of what was to come. But he saw the fighting around him and realized how war destroys so many lives so quickly.
I don't like war at all. People will be killed, some people will be maimed, some people will be impoverished. Over what? As human beings, we should be able to sit together and solve our problems peacefully.
It was March the 2nd, 1944. Isaac and his colleagues were having breakfast on the west bank of the Caladan River. It was a scene similar to this. But they had no idea the Japanese were on the opposite bank, poised to open fire.
When we were attacked, when the shots rang out at 8 o'clock, tried to take over. We were not quite at the front. We were not expecting attack at all. I didn't know I was hit by a bullet. I didn't know. It was when I tried to crawl. I couldn't crawl anymore. I was tired. I've lost a lot of blood. I couldn't crawl. My trousers was soaked in blood, and my battle jacket soaked in blood. It was then I realized that I was in trouble, big trouble. Where do I go from here, God? It was like a dream. Is this me boy?